Meredith Kercher and Amanda Knox from witnesses to suspects to prisoners. November in Perugia, Italy, carried a chill that seemed heavier than usual in 2007. The medieval streets, cobblestone and narrow, twisted like veins through the city, carrying whispers of centuries past. University students from across Europe hustled through the piazzas, their laughter echoing off stone walls, oblivious to the tragedy about to shatter their bubble of safety. In a quiet neighborhood on Via della Pergola, a seemingly ordinary apartment hummed with life, belonging to three young women pursuing their dreams abroad. Among them was Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old British exchange student whose ambitions for a future in the arts and languages made her bright, confident, and seemingly untouchable. On the night of November 1st, the apartment should have been alive with the usual chatter and casual chaos of student life. Amanda Knox, her 20-year-old American roommate, had returned from a night out with friends, carrying the glow of an adventurous evening. Across the hall, or perhaps lost in another room, Meredith's presence was almost ghostly in her absence from the living room. The Italian night pressed in silently, the streetlights casting long shadows through the apartment windows. Outside, the city remained blissfully unaware that violence was about to invade one of its quietest corners. The morning of November 2nd erupted in horror. Meredith Kercher's lifeless body was discovered in her bedroom, the scene grotesque in its violation of innocence. Her throat had been brutally slashed. Blood painted the walls in a grim testimony to the violence that had taken place. Italian investigators arrived swiftly, cordoning off the apartment and ushering neighbors and students into a world they never expected to enter. Crime scene tape cut through the sleepy neighborhood like a jagged wound, and reporters began their relentless swirl around Perugia, their cameras and microphones transforming the once quiet street into a spectacle of tragedy. Amanda Knox, still reeling from the shock, initially became a witness, offering details to the police about the night's events. She described her movements, her observations, the small tensions that had flitted through the apartment days earlier, everything meticulously catalogued, but all seemingly innocent. At first, the investigators treated her statements as critical eyewitness accounts, a piece of the puzzle they hoped would guide them to the true perpetrator. Knox described her confusion and panic, but in the eyes of the Italian authorities, panic began to look like something darker: guilt. Raffaele Sollecito, Knox's Italian boyfriend, was drawn into the spiraling investigation almost immediately. He had been seen with Knox that night, and his alibi, like hers, would later be scrutinized with intense skepticism. The police, grappling with the complexity of an international case in a foreign city, began to treat the initial witnesses not just as sources of information, but as possible suspects. Every detail Knox and Sollecito had shared, their whereabouts, their interactions, even their casual arguments, was dissected for inconsistencies. In the charged atmosphere of the investigation, every human emotion became suspect: fear, nervousness, confusion. Perugia itself transformed into a stage for one of the most sensational criminal investigations in Europe in decades. The media descended, their cameras hungry for every tear, every statement, every hint of scandal. Tabloids in Italy and across the Atlantic painted a picture of Knox as an enigma, a bold, independent American in a foreign land. Every photograph of her walking past the police station, every quote she gave, was twisted into evidence in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, Raffaele, quiet and reserved, became a shadowy figure alongside her, a partner in suspicion simply for being present at the wrong time. The apartment, once a sanctuary, was dissected by forensic teams. DNA swabs, fingerprints, and fibers were catalogued, analyzed, and debated. Small traces of blood in the bathroom, on a broken window latch, became focal points of contention. Investigators theorized about the killer's movements, the timeline, and the motive, but with each revelation, the story became more complex, more twisted. Friends of Meredith recounted the normality of her life, the laughter, the late-night study sessions, and her dreams. Each testimony clashed with the brutality of the crime, emphasizing the incomprehensible nature of the violence. Knox's behavior in the following days raised eyebrows among detectives. Her grief, tinged with moments of seeming levity, was interpreted as callous or rehearsed. Small contradictions in her account, possibly innocent slips of memory under stress, were elevated into signs of potential culpability. Sollecito, equally caught in the storm, tried to navigate a maze of questioning, inconsistencies in translation, and cultural misunderstandings that amplified every perceived misstep. The Italian investigators, under immense pressure to solve the case quickly, began to focus on the two students as prime suspects. Rumors spread like wildfire. International headlines splashed provocative images and inflammatory claims. American students suspected in British roommate's murder. Perugia nightmare, love, lies, and blood. Public opinion swirled with shock and fascination. Families of Meredith, Knox, and Sollecito were thrust into a whirlwind of media scrutiny, facing the impossible challenge of separating fact from speculation. Knox's personal life was dissected under a microscope. Her love life, her partying habits, her independence, all became ammunition in a story far larger than herself. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered fragments of a world beyond the apartment walls. People in Perugia whispered about a minor burglary ring, about petty thefts in student neighborhoods, about outsiders with motives unknown. Shadows lengthened around Knox and Sollecito's lives. Every friend interviewed, every neighbor questioned, added layers of complexity. Nothing was as straightforward as it seemed. The evidence, both forensic and circumstantial, began pointing in ways that nobody could have predicted. The neat timeline of a single intruder turned into a labyrinth of possibilities, each darker than the last. Late one night, detectives discovered a clue that would shift the investigation's direction entirely. Hidden in Meredith's bedroom was a small, overlooked piece of evidence, a fragment of a purse strap, partially bloodied, tucked under a dresser. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but in forensic terms, it was a bombshell. Whoever had left it had inadvertently given investigators a tangible connection that could either implicate the students or direct them elsewhere. The team worked tirelessly to trace its origins, aware that the next breakthrough, or misstep, could decide lives. As days stretched into weeks, Knox and Sollecito were no longer merely witnesses, they were suspects under intense scrutiny. Their routines were monitored, their statements interrogated, their relationships examined with surgical precision. Every movement, every reaction, became evidence. The atmosphere was suffocating, a pressure cooker of suspicion and fear. In interviews, Knox's candidness sometimes backfired, and Sollecito's quiet demeanor was read as coldness or evasion. The detectives, desperate for answers, operated under immense public and media pressure, while the international community watched with bated breath. The days after the discovery of Meredith's notebook turned Perugia into a city on edge. Police began to retrace every step of the British student's final hours, interviewing neighbors, classmates, and anyone who had crossed paths with her. Every detail of Knox and Sollecito's movements was scrutinized with surgical intensity. Text messages, emails, and casual phone calls were dissected for hidden meaning. Innocent actions, like Knox going out for a late-night cappuccino or Sollecito visiting friends, were twisted into possible cover-ups. The young couple, once simply students abroad, now navigated a world where every glance and gesture could be interpreted as guilt. The Italian justice system, with its layers of judges, prosecutors, and forensic experts, quickly became the stage for one of the most controversial trials in modern Europe. Prosecutors presented a narrative built around timing, DNA evidence, and behavioral analysis. Knox's text messages, in particular, were scrutinized. One seemingly innocent joke to a friend about Meredith's messy room was portrayed as evidence of tension and possible motive. Small lies or omissions, sometimes mere misrememberings, were amplified into proof of deceit. Outside the courtroom, media outlets across the globe framed Knox as an audacious, unrepentant American, a portrayal that would haunt her through years of public trial. Forensic evidence became the battlefield of the trial. The bra clasp found in Meredith's room, initially a small, nearly invisible fragment, became central to the prosecution's case. DNA testing suggested a link to Sollecito, though experts debated the reliability of the sample. Critics argued that contamination and mishandling during collection could have tainted the results. Yet, for prosecutors, the evidence was definitive. The two students were not just nearby, they were implicated. Knox's presence in the apartment the night of the murder, once explained as coincidence or innocent misjudgment, now became framed as potential premeditation. The media frenzy intensified, particularly in the United States and Britain. Cable news shows dissected every courtroom appearance, while tabloids published sensational headlines, often based on leaks or unverified sources. Knox and Sollecito were vilified before any final judgment. Social media, still in its early years, swirled with speculation, memes, and outrage. The trial was no longer simply a legal proceeding. It had become a global spectacle, where public perception threatened to eclipse truth. Friends of Knox recalled her panic and heartbreak, but the narrative outside the courtroom painted her as cold, manipulative, or even dangerous. Inside the courtroom, tension was relentless. Prosecutors painted a picture of two students whose carefree nights masked darker impulses. Witnesses described quarrels and odd behaviors in the apartment building, footsteps at strange hours, the sound of a window being forced open, doors left unlocked. Every anecdote became a potential piece of a puzzle whose edges didn't quite fit together. Defense attorneys argued for innocence, highlighting inconsistencies in witness testimony and gaps in forensic analysis. The clash between these narratives, innocence and accusation, kept the entire courtroom on edge, the audience sensing that every moment could tip the balance. The investigation revealed more layers that complicated the story. Knox and Sollecito's relationship, while seemingly normal for college students, was dissected for hidden tension. Were arguments that friends described minor or reflective of deeper conflict? Did their late-night activities constitute suspicious behavior, or simply ordinary youth? Investigators speculated on possible motives, jealousy, anger, or opportunistic theft, but nothing concrete could be confirmed. Yet in the fog of suspicion, uncertainty itself became dangerous, and the two students increasingly felt the walls of accusation closing in. The prosecution introduced new testimony that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Neighbors reported hearing screams the night of the murder, faint but unmistakable. Some described a figure moving stealthily through the apartment building's courtyard, a shadow that vanished before anyone could confront it. Defense lawyers challenged these accounts, citing the unreliability of memory under stress and the darkness of the narrow streets. Yet the accounts fueled a narrative that Knox and Sollecito were near the scene during a critical window of time, further heightening suspicion. As the trial wore on, the personal lives of all involved became a minefield. Meredith's family, grieving their daughter's brutal death, sat in court listening to the minutiae of her life dissected and debated. Their pain was compounded by the idea that the accused, Knox and Sollecito, might never face the full consequences, or might be wrongfully convicted. Knox's own family faced harassment from the media and public, their lives upended by the glare of international attention. Each day in the courtroom added layers of pressure, tension, and fear, not just for the accused, but for everyone connected to the case. Then came the moment that would ignite controversy and speculation for years to come. Investigators claimed to find traces of Knox's DNA on a knife recovered from Sollecito's apartment. The prosecution argued this was the murder weapon, and that Knox's connection to it placed her directly in the crime. Defense experts contested the evidence, citing contamination, mishandling, and questions about how such a knife could be linked to the crime scene. Yet the courtroom drama intensified. Every new piece of forensic evidence was a double-edged sword, capable of condemning or exonerating. The story outside the courtroom mirrored the chaos inside. Italian newspapers splashed Knox's face across front pages with bold, accusatory captions. American tabloids emphasized her youth and perceived boldness, sometimes vilifying her as an attention seeker or a cold manipulator. Social media users debated endlessly. Innocent student or guilty accomplice. Raffaele, quiet and reserved, became a secondary target, his image twisted into that of a calculating partner in crime. Friends who knew the pair were stunned by the growing perception that they were capable of unspeakable violence. As months passed, Tension mounted in the streets of Perugia. Students whispered, tourists gawked, and reporters prowled around the university neighborhood. Knox and Sollecito were placed under house arrest, their lives reduced to surveillance, court appearances, and endless interrogations. Every interaction, every movement, became fodder for the investigation and media coverage. The young Americans and Italians trapped in this nightmare were forced to navigate a legal system vastly different from what they knew, under the shadow of suspicion that never let up. And just when it seemed the trial had reached a fever pitch, a shocking revelation shook the case. A local witness came forward, claiming to have seen a man lurking near Meredith's apartment in the days before her murder, a stranger with no known connection to the students. This new testimony suggested that the narrative of Knox and Sollecito as the sole suspects might be incomplete. The courtroom erupted with debate. Could someone else have been involved? Had the focus on the students obscured a more dangerous reality? For prosecutors, it was a threat to their case. For defense attorneys, a lifeline that could save 2 lives hanging in the balance. The tension reached its peak when investigators revisited the crime scene. They discovered discrepancies in the initial forensic report, footprints that didn't match Knox or Sollecito, fibers that seemed unrelated to anything in the apartment. It became clear that the crime scene had been more complex than originally believed. The neat story prosecutors had tried to weave began to fray at the edges. Evidence that once seemed damning now raised more questions than answers, deepening the mystery around Meredith's murder. It ends with a confrontation that would ripple through the courtroom and the media. Defense attorneys presented new evidence, suggesting that critical pieces of forensic analysis had been mishandled or misinterpreted. In response, prosecutors doubled down, painting Knox and Sollecito as manipulative, calculating, and dangerous. The courtroom buzzed with tension as every word, every piece of evidence, was debated fiercely. The international audience, glued to television screens and news sites, sensed that the story was far from over. And then, in the final, heart-stopping moment, a previously overlooked surveillance tape surfaced. It showed a shadowy figure leaving the vicinity of Meredith's apartment building late at night. The movements were quick, precise, almost predatory. For the first time, the possibility that someone else had been at the scene became undeniable. Knox and Sollecito were still implicated, but now the case had gained a layer of complexity that no one could ignore. The investigators realized that the truth might be far stranger, far more twisted, than they, or anyone else, had anticipated. By 2009, the trial of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito had captured global attention. Courtrooms were packed, journalists crowded the hallways, and news channels in Europe and America covered every twist. In Perugia, the medieval streets that once carried laughter now seemed haunted, lined with onlookers and police alike. Knox and Sollecito sat side by side, facing accusations that would define the rest of their lives, their expressions alternating between bewilderment, fear, and defiance. The prosecution's case was relentless. They painted Knox as manipulative, using her charm and intelligence to conceal darker impulses, and portrayed Sollecito as the quiet accomplice, a presence that allowed evil to unfold. DNA evidence, blood traces, and alleged behavioral inconsistencies were all presented as damning proof. Prosecutors argued that Knox's and Sollecito's movements the night Meredith was murdered were no coincidence. They were deliberate and calculated. Every detail of their alibis was dissected, replayed, and scrutinized until nothing seemed trustworthy. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Headlines screamed, "American student accused of murdering British roommate," and "Perugia nightmare, love, lies, and blood." Social media debates raged, fueled by half-truths and speculation. Knox's image was scrutinized endlessly, her personality caricatured as audacious, unpredictable, and untrustworthy. Sollecito was portrayed as a shadow figure, complicit by association. Public opinion formed well before any verdict, creating a pressure cooker that threatened to spill into the legal process itself. Meanwhile, the families involved were trapped in a relentless storm of grief, anger, and anxiety. Meredith's parents, bewildered by the international scrutiny, demanded justice, but each court development left them more frustrated. Knox's family, thousands of miles away in Seattle, struggled to support their daughter under the glare of suspicion and vilification. Sollecito's family faced similar turmoil in Italy, balancing the hope for exoneration against the fear of a harsh sentence. The human cost of the case was immense, touching lives far beyond the immediate tragedy. In the courtroom, the defense focused on unraveling the prosecution's narrative. They highlighted procedural errors in evidence collection, questioned the reliability of forensic results, and emphasized inconsistencies in witness testimony. The bra clasp, once central to the case, became a point of contention. Defense experts argued that contamination could not be ruled out, and that the DNA evidence was far from definitive. Every small revelation seemed to tilt the scales slightly toward innocence, though the shadow of suspicion never fully lifted. The tension reached its peak when new forensic analysis called into question the DNA on the murder weapon and other critical evidence. Experts revealed that lab contamination, mishandling, and misinterpretation could have produced false positives. Suddenly, a case that seemed airtight began to show cracks. Prosecutors doubled down, claiming the inconsistencies were minor, but the seeds of doubt had already been planted. For Knox and Sollecito, each day in court became a desperate struggle for credibility, a fight to survive in a system where the odds felt stacked against them. Then came the emotional testimony that shook everyone in the courtroom. Meredith's friends recounted the final hours before her death, describing her as lively, hopeful, and utterly unaware of the danger surrounding her. Their accounts painted a vivid picture of the victim as someone who trusted those around her, someone whose ordinary life had been violently interrupted. The contrast between Meredith's innocence and the brutal reality of her murder made every forensic debate feel even more urgent, every courtroom exchange a moral battlefield.